I feel like I'm teleporting back to that place where I felt uneasy or my life was threatened. Her mother went through the same thing, and her mother's mother also. And so I kept thinking, well, why are we not naming what this is? We are basically just transferring their pain from their minds to their bodies.
So my parents are from Bangladesh, and a lot of brown people, like everybody we know, we all have trauma. And so I'm super excited to talk about this.
Especially young minds that can be very susceptible to self-esteem issues, anxiety, to depression, to so many mental health conditions in connection to the ways that they use social media.
We have a truly special guest with us today, Dr. Mariel Buqué, a Columbia University trained psychologist, intergenerational trauma expert, and author of the groundbreaking book, Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. Dr. Buqué's holistic approach to therapy incorporates ancient and indigenous healing practices, helping countless individuals break the cycle of trauma and find healing. She has been featured on major media outlets and recognized as one of the School of Greatness's 100 greatest people doing good in 2022.
Was it war? Was it displacement? What was it?
So I was born and raised in Uzbekistan, a post-Soviet Union country, and my trauma stems from the collapse of the Soviet Union during my early years. There was a strong sense of ideology.
I don't want to sound pessimistic over here.
What about the next generation?
Yeah.
What about my kids?
Dr. Mariel, welcome. Dr. Mariel, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, for having me, and for being willing to talk about a topic that I think is really important for us to have in the conversation of mental wellness. So thank you.
I am super excited to have this conversation in particular because intergenerational trauma is like, so my parents are from Bangladesh, and a lot of brown people, like everybody we know, we all have trauma. And so I'm super excited to talk about this because I can't speak for other communities, but I can speak for my communities. And I think that this is going to be something that we can all really benefit from. But before I go ahead and start talking about that and get into all the good stuff, I just saw a recent post that you shared about AI, and it's about to make social media much more toxic. That was a very important post that you shared. I think I think you're right. Can you talk a little bit more about that? This podcast is sponsored by ArgoPrep, an award-winning edtech company serving over 1 million students nationwide. We understand that as parents, you want to ensure that your child receives the best education possible. Say hello to ArgoPrep. With over 15 plus educational awards earned in just the past year, ArgoPrep's platform offers your child video lessons, quizzes, drills, printable worksheets, and more. Best of all, your ArgoPrep subscription comes included with 4 comprehensive digital workbooks that cover all 4 subjects: math, ELA, science, and social studies. Visit ArgoPrep.com today and start your free trial.
Yeah, social media, it has its benefits. It connects people, right? It's a social, connector in that way. But it also has a way in which it can produce, and has been known to produce, very adverse impact for all of us, really, but especially young minds, right? That can be very susceptible to self-esteem issues, to anxiety, to depression, to so many mental health conditions in connection to the ways that they use social media. And now you bring in this added element that is almost kind of being thrusted at us, in the current, just right now in the zeitgeist of our time, AI that can really warp what reality is for a lot of us, and especially for individuals who don't have the capacity to distinguish. Yeah. And maybe AI won't even allow us the opportunity, the agency, and the choice to distinguish because it looks so real. So the messaging that can be relayed via AI, this article was in The Atlantic, by the way, if anybody wants to look it up, but the messaging that can be relayed, the ways in which people are not going to be able to really distinguish what is real and what is a fabricated message that is being delivered by whoever is behind the AI technology. That is a very dangerous place for us to be as far as society, in terms of our mental health and in terms of the information that we ingest that can then develop into a lot of these things that we tend to see happening with social media, the self-esteem issues, the anxiety, and all of that. So I am a bit trepidatious about AI technology, and I do agree with the article's proposition to have AI information watermarked so that we have an understanding of the fact that something is coming from an alternate source other than a human being.
I strongly agree with the article that was shared. I don't know how we're going to get there. I feel like we've opened up a box that we unfortunately cannot close. I don't want to sound pessimistic over here. We also heavily take a look into all of the. We pay attention to the space very carefully as well. In fact, I just trained my voice yesterday using an AI model. I won't tell the company's name, but uh, I fed it some data, and its job is to sound like me. I can now copy and paste an entire article or whatever, and it
Mm-hmm.
should sound like me. And I was a little hesitant. No way it's going to sound. There's so many companies in the space, and it sounds too robotic. I was shocked because it sounded like me. You At this point, you can still tell that it is a doctored version. It's not authentic. You can still hear slight robotic elements. But if I give it to one of our internal editors and they can play with the voice, like I don't know if you've seen like Drake released AI songs, and some of the songs they sound amazing. I mean, you cannot tell that it's fake. I
Mm-hmm.
am worried, but from the article standpoint of view, you are correct. If there are bad actors, we can now heavily influence one side because we can mass create content very easily
Mm-hmm.
with the use of AI. So you can steer people's minds and shift them in a different direction. But
Mm-hmm.
look, I don't know what to say. I just don't know. It's a very interesting time. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
I'll use the word interesting time that we're living in. But I think we're going to see a lot of issues come out of this. But Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Mariel, I would love to take to now kind of walk you back and what inspired you to focus and your work on healing intergenerational trauma. Why that line of work?
It's a great question, and that really came out of a lot of, maybe let's call it frustration, frustration of being a clinician and being in what we call like our clinical team meetings while I was still working in the hospital systems. And in those meetings, we would always like talk about the clients that we needed a little bit more help with from each other. We would like present a case and say, this is what's happening. Does anyone have any feedback on how I can proceed with treatment? And that's typically how clinic teams meetings tend to go. And the stories were like the same across the board. Everyone kept having the same story that they would be relaying about a patient or a client that they would be working with. And those stories had these intergenerational threads. People would say, well, her mother went through the same thing and her mother's mother also. And so I kept thinking, well, why are we not naming what this is? Why are we not identifying that there is a thread and that cycles have not been broken, that there's been a modeling process of how to deal with stress or how to ingest trauma that is a part of this family's lineage history? And why is it that we're only really focusing on the one person in the one generation and seeing that this person continues to be in treatment for years and decades and isn't getting better? Something's not working. And so some of the frustration came from sitting for years in these meetings and thinking something's not working. We're not addressing the elephants in the room, and the elephant is intergenerational trauma. And in addition to that, really taking a look inside, because uh, the landscape of therapy also requires that you as a therapist look within yourself and learn yourself better, right? It's a really critical part of how you can be of best service to the people that you serve from a therapeutic place. And so I had to look at myself a lot too and think, oh wow, wait, there's patterns in my own world, and there's things that have been there. And I don't know the very first thing about how to address this. Why has that not been a part of my training? And I thought, okay, I I feel like I need to do something about this. And I started reading a lot of texts that now are like my staples. The Body Keeps the Score, My Grandmother's Hands, a lot of books that have that element of intergenerational trauma embedded in the language of the book. And I thought, we don't have a healing protocol that directly addresses this. And that's when I felt like I need to make this my mission. So it really kind of burgeoned out of that.
Wow. Wow. I love that. I'll pass it over to Vlad.
Yeah, I would like to stay on this topic and discuss your book, Break the Cycle,
Mm.
where you discuss how trauma can be transmitted from one generation to another. So I understand that intergenerational trauma can be difficult to identify and address, as it may not be immediately obvious, right? That current problems are connected to the past traumas experienced by previous generations. And the title of the book, I love it. It's just screaming by itself, break the cycle.
Yeah.
So could you please explain this concept in more detail and provide some practical examples?
Yes, absolutely. So, Break the Cycle is a book that is a healing guide for intergenerational trauma. So, what I decided that I was going to do was that in the past years of my work, I had been working with individuals who had this lineage trauma from the perspective that I have been trained in psychology, which is now called holistic psychology, which is really integrating a lot of ancestral and indigenous practices and holistic practices into the work of therapy as well. So I thought, well, what if I literally like took all the work from my therapy room and put it in a book so that people have access to the tools that they're going to need to start addressing intergenerational trauma, not just talk about what it is, right? Because yes, we need that information. And I do offer a very comprehensive understanding of what intergenerational trauma is. But how do we then address it? How do we start the healing process? Because I think that that's what we really need right now. We need more than just understanding what it is. We need to every single day address it in our own lives. And so this book is basically like a healing guide that has a number of different healing practices to help people to start extracting intergenerational trauma from their lives. So the ways that I reflect intergenerational trauma, I think are really important too to name for people who don't know. It's the only type of trauma that can be handed down the family line. So it happens at the intersection of what I call our biology and our psychology of intergenerational trauma, which is basically any kind of genetic expressions that our parents and grandparents may have had that are reflective of how they themselves were in chronic stress or in trauma themselves. And in addition to that, the biology side is anything that happens post conception. If there was the chaos in the home, maybe fights, maybe a divorce, if there was the experience of people just being in their own trauma responses, and maybe like a mother who was so withdrawn because she was traumatized that she wasn't able to be attuned for her baby. And then in that moment, there's intergenerational trauma that's already flourishing because the baby now is, in a state where they need a mother, they're not being cared for. And now you have one of the adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, right? Like the misattunement or the not being cared for. And so all of that is basically how we tend to understand, okay, intergenerational trauma has been a part of this family line. There are already two generations that are in traumatized minds and bodies. This is something that we need to address from a holistic standpoint. And the reason why I say holistic is because when what I have seen and what a lot of my colleagues who are holistic psychologists have seen is that when we start talking to people about their traumas, but we're not addressing how their bodies are capturing the trauma or how their bodies are feeling deeply uncomfortable and overwhelmed when they're talking about their trauma history, we are basically just transferring their pain from their minds to their bodies. We're not doing
That's
full healing work.
that's really deep, by the way. That's powerful. Okay.
Mhm. So it's really important that I work with a person to help them to learn how to settle their bodies first. I do it first before I even transition into, okay, well, let's talk about how trauma flowed through your family line. Let's build your intergenerational family tree and have an understanding of where the trauma responses were in your family and what prompted them. Was it war? Was it displacement? Was it a divorce? Was it domestic abuse? Like, what was it? But before we get into all of that, I need that person to feel settled. Because if we think about the body, and when people are unsettled, meaning that when they're in survival mode or when their nervous systems are hyperactive or overactive, what's going to happen is that from a biological perspective, their brains are going to do, for lack of a better term, they're going to mildly shut down the areas of their brains that they need for complex thinking. So their cortical brain, the very frontal area of their brain. And if you're sitting there trying to workshop with a person about their healing, bringing about solutions, things that they need to do in their day-to-day lives, they're not going to be present. They're going to be dissociating. They're not going to actually be able to utilize to their greatest potential their cortical brain that they're going to need to digest all the information that's happening, because they're going to be in survival mode. So I need a person to first be in a settled nervous system. I need to do the kinds of practices with them, like breathing, like humming, like rocking, all the things that I know are going to help them to feel rested and restored and settled and calm. And then we get into the process of, okay, now let's talk about what happened.
This practice are before each session, or they have to practice at home as well?
I actually overload these practices, and there's a reason why. I call what I do with clients in the session itself like the sandwich method. I may have made that up. I haven't heard of anyone using it. I just thought, intuitively, I thought, we're gonna settle your nervous system before we get into anything. And then after we get into it, you're also feeling pretty overwhelmed. So, in the sandwich method, what I do is that I help people to settle their bodies before we get into the work, right? So, I do that with sound bath meditations, with visualization, imagery practices, breathing, all of the things that are going to help us to feel more settled. Then, when we get into the story, that person is able to be more attuned, more aware of what we're talking about, less dissociative, like all the things that we're going to need. But what happens when we talk about trauma is that our nervous system responds to it. It registers, okay, the trauma's coming back up. I feel like I'm teleporting back to that place where I felt uneasy or my life was threatened. And so we have to go back into settling the nervous system after we talk about everything, which is why I call it the sandwich method, because I do it at the beginning, kind of like a bun, right? And the meat is in the middle, and then the other part of the bun, is the regulation after we talk about everything. But even outside of the actual sessions, I also invite clients to do the same in their day to day. So I say, go about your day with the sandwich method. The first 5 minutes, do some breath work. The last 5 minutes, do some progressive muscle relaxation. And that way, you settle your nervous system throughout your day as well.
Yeah. Before I move on to my next question, I would like to share some quick story about myself. So I was born and raised in Uzbekistan, a post-Soviet Union country. And one aspect of my trauma stems from the collapse of the Soviet Union during my early years, which I think resulted in a loss of ideology and attachment to the country. So at that time, many people were leaving the country, while in the United States, there was a strong sense of ideology. And I'm unsure whether this experience constitutes the trauma or made me a stronger person. So my next question is related to my experience. I know you talked about the importance of tangible therapeutical practices for breaking the cycle of inherited trauma. So could you please explain how they can contribute to passing down the strengths instead of pain?
I love that you're talking about the strength side, because it's easy for us to go into all the ways in which pain has been a part of our journeys or our histories or our parents and grandparents and ancestors' history. Because when you think about a displacement, such as what is very much like a part of your history, right? And displacement with identity shifts, right? And that also happens when we now inhabit different lands, and then we have to be almost like this like person that has separate identities that they now have to integrate in order to become like a whole. There's a lot that happens in the mind to like try and make sense of all of that, right? And so we can focus a lot on that, but we forget that we are here today having a conversation on intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing, being able to produce healing ourselves, and that there's so much strength in just us being able to have this conversation today together, right? Where does that strength even come from? We have to wonder who offered us resilience, who offered us an opportunity to feel heard, to feel like our identities mattered, to feel connected to our communities, even the communities that were in the new land. We have to think about all those things. And then we also have to think about the biology of it all. There's this concept that we're learning more and more about in the area of collectively, like any area that touches on genetics, right? Which is called epigenetic preparedness. And what that is basically like when anybody that is older in our lineage has gone through something, their bodies didn't only manifest trauma, it also manifested this almost like a instinctual way of learning that there is a threat in the environment. Like our grandparents may have, understood that that if there's a knock on the door, that probably means like something bad might happen, right? Like, but they also had a way of instilling or experiencing survival in those moments that has also been passed down. And so we have like a way in which our bodies are also resilient genetically and biologically, but we also have ways in which our bodies alert us to the possibilities that a threat may be present. So we have both. So I love the idea of like always integrating the resilience or the wisdom that is going to be really essential for us to hold on to while we go through healing around intergenerational trauma.
Wow.
One more follow-up question here I have. So
Yeah.
let's say I broke my cycle, right? And I healed my trauma. What about my kids? Do they still will have it, some new trauma, or they will be without it?
Almost every single conversation that I have is one in which people are like, what about the next generation? What about my
Yeah.
kids? And also for parents that already have kids, like, did I pass it on already? One person even said, have I screwed them up? Like, those were like their exact words. And we have to think about what happens in reference to when you build resilience in people. And this is why I cover a number of different chapters that focus on resilience in my book, because when we increase resilience with day-to-day practices that can actually help us to feel stronger, it helps us to buffer trauma. It helps us to absorb traumatic experiences differently so that we don't feel weighed down by them. So what that means is that if you have kids and you can teach them how to meditate, you can teach them how to be mindful, you can teach them how to breathe every day, you can teach them how to write their thoughts down and their feelings down so that they don't feel like they're like floating in like this inner feeling chaos and don't have anywhere to place those feelings. If you can teach them the things that we were never taught to do, that we had to then learn as adults, you're preparing them for them to not be legacy bearers of these intergenerational trauma pains, but to instead know how to cope through tough circumstances that they're going to come upon. They're going to have a difficult breakup at some point in their lives. But are they going to plummet into a 6-month depression because of the breakup? Or are they going to have the actual tools that they need to cope through the circumstance and come out of it feeling stronger and more emboldened. See, it's like, we can do these things for our children now and set them up for a better future and to be cycle breakers themselves, which is the beautiful thing of being able to be a cycle breaking parent. So I think there's a lot of hope in that. I see a lot of hope in people that are breaking cycles, but also want to know about, well, what's my impact for the next generation?
In order to be a cycle breaker, is it necessary for that individual to go through the healing themselves? For let me clarify what I when I ask that question. So, for example, there are some people, and I put classify myself in this category, which is these individuals that put up tons of layers and layers and layers, and so and their life is fantastic and everything is beautiful, although there was there was that intergenerational trauma that has passed on. There's just so many layers, and that individual or that group of people just never, they never seek to, they never go back to heal it, but they know they're very conscious of not passing those same traumas down the line. But so is it necessary in order to be a cycle breaker, you actually have to go in and do the work and break down those layers and explore that journey and go through that route, or is that not fundamentally necessary? That's curious.
Well, healing is very versatile, right? So, us as people, we're going to heal differently person to person. And I think that the people that are able to go about life still being able to do the things that they do, despite the fact that they have been living with pain, are some of the most remarkable people I've ever come across, right? I mean, talk about like strength squared, right? But the thing about that is that at some point in time, some of that tends to break down for us.
Mm.
And when we don't do at least a little bit of the digging work to like excavate some of the pain and create lightness in our lives, it does come back. It eventually makes
Yeah.
its way to the fore of our lives. And a good example of that is the pandemic. What happened during
Mm.
the pandemic? People who were well for years were all of a sudden feeling like, oh my goodness, I have to sit with my emotions because I'm not working, or I have to
Mm.
sit. Now I have to go back to living, in my parents' home, and all of those old wounds are coming back, and I don't have any kind of protocol or strategy for dealing with that. So it can come back to us, right, in unprecedented ways. Like nobody knew a pandemic was coming and that it was going to thrust us into isolation or into
Right.
being with our thoughts for extended periods of time. So why not work through the things that can make us even more vulnerable now? Because look at the uptick that we experienced in mental health conditions post pandemic. We
Mm.
have had a significant amount of people developing or at least being more attuned to the fact that they have anxiety, depression, trauma, right? There's been a number of different, even, it, areas that perhaps are a little bit more severe on the mental health spectrum have come up. Why? Because people were left to now deal with the emotions that they were hiding with the busy lives that they were
Mm.
leading.
That's a very good point. That is 100% accurate. It's easy to cover up the feelings and think you're fantastic when you're so busy and you have this job and you have different roles to play.
Yeah.
But the pandemic is definitely a situation, or later down in your life, whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you may you may not have that privilege anymore, where you're going to see a lot of
Mhm.
those emotions from your childhood come up. Wow, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
Dr. Mariel, how do we come together as a community? Like, I see initiatives like, again, I can only speak about my community because that's the community that I know, and I see
Mhm.
progress being made in this, where we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma and what we can do. But how do we come together as how can individuals come together as a community? Because I think it's still very hard. Again, in my community, so you see a couple of activists here that talk about that, but that's about it. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't really see any real community coming in together to make a true difference yet. And let me, sorry if I'm miswording things, because if it's already very impactful of what's going on. But when I mean a true difference, I mean on a much larger scale. What
Mm-hmm.
can we do as individuals to really help or to build up this community and talk about this?
Mm-hmm. It's a really important point. In my book, I do discuss. There's one chapter that I specifically have dedicated to collective traumas, or the deepened traumas within our communities that enter our home, is what I call it. So when collective trauma enters your home is the name of the chapter, and really that was very specifically named that way because we're not people that live apart from our world. We are a part of the world, and the world feeds trauma into our homes as well. Because when there are systemic inequities, when there are cultural values and influences that are harmful or unhealthy, when there are actual wars that occur or natural disasters that displace entire communities, when all of these things are present and then go unaddressed for generations upon generations, people are holding on to the stress and trauma of all of that and passing it down. So we have to talk about the collective trauma element and the more kind of cultural element as well. So whenever we're thinking about something so major like helping an entire community, people oftentimes feel so debilitated by that task
Mm,
that they
mm,
instead say, well, it's a little too big for me. I'm probably not going to do it. Right. But
yeah.
if we break it down and we tell people, hey, this week, just do this one thing for a community that you care about, it feels like a more tangible task. So one person may not be able to save an entire community or the whole world, but one person can deposit one thing. And if you have a community of 10 million, imagine 10 million one little things that get deposited into that community, and how
Yeah.
all of those little things taken together can actually disrupt the trauma that continues to be perpetuated in the community. 10 million of those people talking about intergenerational trauma in a very wholehearted way inside their homes, to fellow community members, within educational centers, within religious centers, like just having the conversation and just depositing a small seed. Imagine that when it's compounded over time. And that's what I engage people in as far as a conversation in my book, because I don't want people to feel like they resort to inaction because it feels like too daunting of a task to tackle the collective trauma piece. I want them to feel like today I can do something today.
Mm, wow. That's very powerful. I want to talk a little bit more about your holistic practices, like sound bath meditation and the breath work in your therapy sessions. Let's a little bit more about that, or actually specifically sound bath meditation. In fact, I watched a YouTube video of a sound bath meditation session that you actually posted just before I hopped on. Like well, actually, let me ask a more specific question. With sound bath meditation, what
Mhm.
is what's the goal? What does sound bath meditation what does that do for the individual?
Mm-hmm. Sound meditation is a very ancient practice that spans thousands of years, and it has its root in Tibetan culture. And it originally, brass bowls were used to emit sounds and sound vibrations. Now people use either brass bowls or quartz bowls made of crystals. And there are different frequencies based on the bowls that emit different kinds of vibrations. What this sound does, it's called like sound medicine, sound bathing, to be more specific about the kind of sound medicine. So the sound bath is basically emitting micro vibrations that help to recalibrate the mind and the body. And how does that work? Well, think about what we're made up of, primarily water.
Hmm.
So when you think about, especially when they put sound bowls like in water, you can see the vibrations. When you think about the fact that you're being bathed in sound and that those vibrations are bouncing off the walls from the bowls and making its way into vibrating your body in a very granular cellular way, it is almost like recalibrating your body and bringing it back to balance. Now, when you think
Hmm.
about trauma and intergenerational trauma specifically, remember that we have a biological component that we have to consider. We have hormones that are flaring up, stress hormones specifically, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, right? Like there's so many different kinds of hormones that at that very moment when stress is prominent in someone's body, they're being spiked up. When we bring balance to the body by almost kind of like shaking it into place, shaking it into balance, we're allowing the body to then feel more rested, more at ease. And for a lot of those like hormonal upticks to then rebalance. So sound bath meditation gives us an opportunity to do that. And I integrate also a lot of almost like meditative mantras inside of my sound bath meditation to really profoundly introduce the mind element into the body work as well. And so that's why it has a very mind, body, and even spiritual kind of effect.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'll pass it over to Vlad.
Yeah, could you please share any story from your therapy room that highlights the power of holistic approach to healing intergenerational trauma, like before and after?
Yes, I'll share a story that's a personal favorite, so much so that I added it in my book. And it's a story of a family that had undergone a significant trauma, and that they had a teenager that came in with the parents. And we were doing a lot of holistic practices. The reason why I bring this story up also is because it was one of those moments where I was like, my eyes widened and I was like, this is working. And it almost kind of like gave me that confirmation as a clinician that felt so good and so grounding. But the family and I, we would do actually some humming. Humming is a really important somatic practice in trauma work because it gives us an opportunity to target the part of the nervous system that actually increases relaxation, the ventral vagal nerve. So what we would do is that we would take some songs. There were sessions that we would have in Spanish because the family was Spanish speaking. And we would take some songs that they all knew and we would hum the songs. But sometimes some people would mess up, or there would be like moments when things would feel like a little bit funny and the whole family would laugh. And not only was laughter becoming like the new contagion effect and not the chaos contagion that they were all tied into for a long period of time in that family, but I was also understanding because I was also reviewing a lot of the studies on like how laughter or gratitude or mindfulness has like actual impacts on the brain. So it was moments when I was like, wow, their mirror neurons are interchanging right now. They're syncing to laughter. They're also humming, so they're regulating their nervous system together. And it's a moment where it's intergenerational, it's collective healing. And the best part of it all is that it was being reflected in the smile that the teenager was giving their parent. And I just thought that this was like such a beautiful moment where we were finally like seeing the effects of the more holistic part of the work, because we'd done a lot of talking through what happened, right? But when we were able to like really elicit that healing response in all of them all at once, it was a moment where I was like, this is good. And then thereafter, for months and months that I continued working with the family, there was improvement, improvement, improvement. And so that became like a replicated process, family after family, client after client, right? Where we would do the holistic practices integrated into the therapeutic work. And I would see it's, I wish that I could almost kind of like help people to see how a person's demeanor changes, right? Sometimes people come in slouched, crying, unwell, heavy. And by the time that we're done with working together, they're sturdy, they're standing straight, their language is different, the way that they reference to themselves is different, the way that they talk about their family units and their communities, vastly different. The way that they feel settled in their own bodies is different. The way that they befriend their bodies versus feeling like their body is their enemy is different. It's just such a different way of going about life that I think everybody deserves to feel, which is why I'm so like, it to me, I feel deeply grateful that I've been able to be a holistic psychologist and see the impact and also relay it in this written form through this book.
Mm. Wow, that's thank you by the way for sharing that story with us. And just for reference, if, in case if you're listening to this right now, Dr. Mariel's book is not yet published, so right, it's coming out January 2024. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay,
January
so
2nd. It's on pre-order now. Yeah.
I'm sorry, January 22nd.
January 2nd, 2024 would be
Yeah,
on shelves, but it's currently on pre-order.
got it. Got it. And we will make another call out action at the end, of course. But I just wanted to reference that because we're talking
Yeah.
about your book. But I want you to know this is some inside scoop over here before
Yeah.
before the book actually comes out. Now,
Mhm.
I know that you do a lot of work providing healing workshops to many companies such as Google, Capital One, and Meta. How do you tailor your approach to address the unique challenges faced by individuals working in these environments?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to approach it, right? So, one, we have to consider that we think of like a Meta as like this massive company with massive impact. And we forget, or we could forget, that there's people there, right? There's people with
Yeah,
histories,
yeah.
with their own triggers, and that when a person like myself goes into a massive organization like that to provide a healing space or a healing workshop or a talk, that very often who I'm reaching are people. So it's people just like you and I, like
Mm,
hoping to gather some tools on how they can be able to feel more settled and show up to work in a way that feels more productive and more attuned. And so the way that I tailor it is by creating like spaces where people can feel heard and heal. But there's also an added element of helping organizations to be people centered and wellness centered. So
mm,
there's two approaches. And sometimes I work with an organization to provide both, and sometimes it's one or the other. Like, for example, during the pandemic, there was a lot of pandemic crisis management and wellness strategies that I was providing a lot of these tech and financial companies, right? So that they knew how to best address the overburdened workforce that was coming into work, even virtually every day, feeling the weight of a
mm,
pandemic together with a lot of other issues that were happening, both personally and collectively. However, once we were starting to transition, a lot of companies were reaching out to me to know, okay, this is uncharted territory. We've never had a workforce come back with anticipatory anxiety about coming back
mm,
into the office space. How do we now work through that and create spaces for healing and for people to feel like they can come into work while also having mental breaks, while also having an opportunity to feel heard by C-level executives, right? Like,
mm,
so a lot of the work that I do, some of it is reactionary to some of the crises that we experience as a world. And some of it just has to do with the maintenance of a healthy workplace environment that can help educational institutions, financial institutions, tech institutions, any institution that houses people, right? To have a better landscape where the constituents that are a part of that organization can feel healthy and well enough
mm.
to carry on their task.
I'd love to spend a little bit of time talking about your personal experiences growing up in an immigrant family from
Mm-hmm.
DR. How did that influence? Can you talk a little bit about your experience growing up in an immigrant family?
Yeah, some of my major experiences of stress and trauma actually come from having been an immigrant to the US myself at age 5, and also seeing the ways in which my family had to navigate the uncharted territory that was the US. And that felt you know like it carried a lot of emotions with it. Also, my family was separated for 10 years because of immigration law. So we actually I didn't live with my father from ages 10 to 21.
Wow.
And so, yeah. And so that's like, prime years of like having a father
Yeah.
around, right? And a father that wanted to be around, but just had that limitation. And, I think now I have such a almost like a deep level of compassion for families that not only like emigrate and have that displacement of
Mm,
identity, kind of like how Vlad had mentioned, like, there's an identity shift or at least like identity reconstruction that needs to happen in that process. But also that, the loss of entire childhoods without a parent, or the loss of no longer being in a country that felt like home.
mm,
Like there's so many losses, right? That's why my work is very, very much also like attending to the grief that we experience when we have to transition, and when we
yeah.
have to like, kind of become a new or restructured version of ourselves, because that's been my experience too. And I also heard a lot of experiences that mirrored that in the therapy room. I was like, oh, that sounds familiar to me because I've lived it. People would
Mm,
come in with immigrant histories and I would be like, I get it, truly I do. And
yeah.
I feel compassion, and I feel the desire to help, because I know how much that hurts to be a person that has to live with a displacement, like an immigration history that can traumatize us.
Thank you so much for sharing that story.
Mm-hmm.
That's like my favorite part about having these discussions. We can ask like specific questions and action
Mm-hmm.
items, but for me at least, I can only speak for myself. I that's this is like the great thing, you being able to share your story, or me like our stories,
Mm-hmm.
our lived experiences are so extremely, uh if you want to call it inspiring, sure, inspiring, motivational, whatever that is, but it's beautiful. That's the word I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful. We can all connect to it, even if we don't have direct experience with that. We can all connect with that. So thank you sincerely for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
But since we're talking a little bit about your childhood, I'd love to talk a little bit about the deep connection to the practice of tea therapy, which began with your grandmother's tea rituals
Yes.
in the Dominican Republic. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So this is kind of one of my favorite things to talk about, which I haven't really expressed, probably in any interview, I don't think, which is where tea therapy even came from. I do reflect it in my book, I think, for the first time, but maybe here for the first time. Um, you know, I once had this moment. My mother makes tea every single night. And one time she was making tea, and I was like, my goodness, that scent is so familiar.
Mm.
I love that scent. And she's telling me in Spanish, she's like, it's limoncillo tea. And I'm like, what is limoncillo? I thought it was limoncello, like, like in Italy.
That's what I thought right now.
So I'm thinking limoncello. Well, that's interesting. It actually, limoncillo translates to lemongrass. And
Mm.
she was making lemongrass tea. And she started talking to me about how my grandmother would make that tea. It's locally sourced in the Dominican Republic. And she would make that tea, and it would be actually really healing for a lot of things. And so she was offering me the tea, my mother, in order to help me heal. I think I may have had like some sort of an inflammatory response, like a cold. And I was like, that's interesting. So, my family comes from deep poverty. So they would just kind of grab onto whatever was in the land. And, lemongrass was one of those things. And it felt so grounding to me to hear about the ways that tea was used as a healing balm for so many generations of my family. And I started making tea every day. And I started using tea as a, a way to ground myself in this just ancestral healing. But also, I started understanding some of the ways in which these botanicals, like a lavender tea or a chamomile, like their properties and the ways in which they can actually help us to feel calm and regulate our mood. And I was like, this is gold. Like, so many people ask me, well, what can I drink, or like what tea or what this, and I'm like, I've got loads of ideas. And I thought, I'm literally like taking my grandmother's wisdom, knowledge, love, and healing and replicating that in this tea session
Yeah,
and in this tea um, information that I'm offering to my clients and to the world. And I thought that that was just such a beautiful way to almost kind of keep my grandmother's legacy. So it's been something that I've held on to with a lot of love. And I feel like a lot of places where I go to speak, and even, my local Starbucks the other day, like someone was like, "Oh my God, I love your tea sessions. They've helped me heal." And I'm
mm,
like, when people say that, I feel like they're saying my grandmother helped, because my grandmother
mm.
was the one who initiated, um, you know, tea sessions with her children in order to heal. So it's just very special to me.
That's
I
very
definitely
beautiful.
should send
Yeah.
you our tea from the mountains of Uzbekistan.
Oh my goodness. That
Because
would
in
be.
there, it's, I mean, it's obviously the Asian culture. It's also all about the tea. It doesn't matter what kind of weather it is. If
Hmm.
it's 100 outside, they will be drinking hot tea.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is what
Sounds like
Anayet
me.
never understands because he is a coffee lover.
Well, my next question. Well, Vlad will certainly get you over some great Uzbekistan tea leaves. But my next
Amazing.
question was, do you drink coffee?
Actually, I do. I drink coffee in the morning.
You see, Vlad?
And a part of the reason why is because I'm a very like Zen person, and I tend to be really like maybe too calm for my morning meetings.
Okay.
So it gives me a little extra bump. But I have, in order to balance it out, I do have like lavender lattes, which I love very much. And so
Mm, okay.
I infuse a bit of lavender tea in the actual latte, and that gives me a little bit of a balance, a slight kick, but still with a little tea in there.
Fair enough. And I will definitely agree with you on your calm voice. Uh, we can I can listen to you for hours. Something
Oh,
about soothing and calm voice.
thank you.
But I do want I only have two more questions for you. Two remaining questions, and so we can wrap up. I
Mhm.
We noticed that you often feature your adorable dogs, Leo and Marley, on your Instagram page.
Yes.
Can you share a funny or any story involving your dogs and how they may have contributed to your own emotional well-being or even
Mhm.
inspired your work in some way?
Mhm. Absolutely. I remember that I gave this tip on social media a couple years back, and the tip actually inspired in me a greater use of my own tip. So the tip was, and it derived from the work that I was doing in the clinical space, but the tip was for us to use our senses to ground ourselves, right? Not an uncommon tip, but I started thinking, well, what do I have to ground myself in my own home? I lived by myself, just me, and back then it was just my one dog, Leo. And I was like, what is it that grounds me so that I can say what I need to say to people from an authentic place and not just kind of like, just throwing social media
Yeah.
stuff out there. And when I thought about like the sense of touch, I thought about Leo automatically, because just touching him, like I grab his face sometimes, like just to play with him, and just the grabbing of his face, or his coat's very soft. Those things create in me a, a flood of like happy emotions. And when I think about happy emotions, I think about happy hormones.
Mm,
And when I think of happy hormones and creating more of those happy hormones in ourselves, I think about the neural connections that are being formed, because our brains are neuroplastic and they create more and more connections as we go through life. And the fact that they're regulating with my dog, who I'm using as a grounding tool, right? And so I was like,
yeah.
I'm sure that Leo didn't come into this life to think that he was going to be a grounding dog, but he just happened to be a therapist dog. And, lucky him, I guess, and lucky
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, that's
But
the first dog to be a therapist.
Yeah. So now, both of them had different coats. One's a poodle, so he has a curly soft coat, and the other one's really, like a straighter coat. And even like when all day when I'm working at home, one's sitting on one side of my lap and the other one's on the other side while my laptop is on top. And so there's something about the warmth that they provide me, the softness that is something that I think has this grounding element that I wanted to relate to folks, but I also wanted to experience myself in a more conscious way, rather than it just being, oh yeah, I have dogs and they make me happy, but how do they make me happy? What's happening in my body when I'm around them? How are my hormones responding to them? How is it that oxytocin, like the connection and love hormone, is like being replicated every day in my lived experience with my dogs? And so it became I probably use too much like scientific kind of applicability to my life every day, but I think it can be really helpful to know all the things that are going on, and it brings me a lot of peace.
I love that. Vlad, do you want to ask the last question, or I'll pass it to you?
Yeah, I think I just wanna add also that I think you are the first person in my life I see who speaks about dogs like this. Because
Yes.
people just taking dogs, okay, dogs make me happy, but not like in this,
Yeah.
as you said, in scientific way.
Yeah.
Uh, yes. So my last question would be, let me see, who has been the strongest or most inspiring person in your life, and what
Mm.
lessons have you learned from them?
Oh wow, I love this question. It's my sister. Her name is Lady, and Lady, she is the original cycle breaker in our family. So she's my elder sister by 3 years, and I would actually like mimic everything that she would do, obviously, like any little sister. But I would also look at the ways that she would do things differently than how we saw growing up, and I would be like, "Oh, that's interesting." And she also is a parent of a 15-year-old, and so she parented very differently than my parents, and the ways that she did it was like clear cut cycle breaking without even having a manual or, any know how of what she was doing. She just knew, I want my kid to be different. I want my kid to, live a life where he's like fully a child. And we were very poor, so we had to work very early. And like there were a lot of things that, kind of took away childhood memories for us. But she wanted to disrupt that cycle, and she did it very intentionally. And she is very inspiring to me for that, because I call people like this alchemizers, like people that just develop or heal or like blossom out of the ashes. Like they don't really have
Mm.
like anything that they would have grabbed onto, but they just like develop these like cycle breaking abilities just by intuition. And I think she's one of those people, and I'm really grateful to have her as a sister.
Wow.
Mhm.
Dr. Bouquet, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been incredibly enlightening and inspiring conversation. For our listeners, we highly recommend that you check out Dr. Mariel's upcoming book, Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma, which is available for pre-order now and is set to release on January 2nd, 2024. You can follow Dr. Mariel on social media as well, and her website. Dr. Mariel, I'll pass it actually over to you. What channels, the website or the uh, social media, social handle, where can
Mhm.
individuals find you?
I am mostly present on Instagram, a little bit on TikTok, but really kind of anywhere I'm at Dr. Buqué. And then, as you mentioned, my website is drmarielbuqué.com, where people can see all the things that I'm up to, but also they can click on all of my socials from there.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute
Yeah.
pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you both, and thank you for having me.